Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video. You may notice that this week's midweek mystery is not on a Wednesday as it usually is, because today's video is actually in collaboration with Now TV. I know, I can't quite believe it either. Now TV is a leading UK streaming service for some of the best TV, box sets, movies, sports and kids entertainment, which you can watch when, where and how you want to watch it. You can stream content to watch through the Now TV app, available on over 60 devices, including the Now TV Smart Stick and Smart Box. But how is this relevant to us? Well, the Sky Crime channel launched on the 1st of October and is available now on Sky and Now TV. Sky Crime is the new home of premium US true crime from Oxygen and HBO. When I tell you these documentaries are high quality, I mean it. These are some of the best accounts of true crime I have ever seen. Sky Crime will take you on a journey through some of the most harrowing and shocking crimes you've ever heard of. It'll make you question everything. It's no secret that true crime is really popular at the moment. I mean, you subscribe to my channel, so you probably get it. And Sky Crime gives you the most well-rounded, high-quality looks into some huge cases. But today's video is going to focus on the murder of 12-year-old Garrett Phillips. The two-part documentary Who Killed Garrett Phillips is available to stream now via the Now TV Entertainment Pass, which costs just $8.99 a month. The documentary is over 3 hours long in total, and today I'm going to be telling you all about the case in my usual format. I can't wait to hear your thoughts and feelings on what happened with this investigation, and I urge you to go and watch the documentary for yourself for an even more in-depth look at the case. This story takes place in a town called Buxom in St. Lawrence County in northern New York State. It's a small town described as cozy and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. More specifically, we're going to be focusing in on 100 Market Street in Buxom, the North Country Manor Apartments. It was a quaint apartment building, very well kept and very homely. It's the 24th of October 2011 when things in this quiet apartment building take an unexpected turn. It's just after 5 PM on a Monday. People are settling down for the night, eating their dinners and getting ready for bed. But just after 5 PM, neighbours on the second floor start to hear some strange noises. They later report that they heard running and a crash. They hear a moan for help, a child's voice. The neighbours knock next door but no one answers, but they swear they hear the door lock click from the inside. They make the decision to call the police, who send an officer to do a welfare check. An officer arrives at the building at 5:14 PM and knocks on the door, just as the neighbour had done. The officer swears he heard somebody walking around inside, but still no one answers. So the officers manage to get hold of the building's landlord, who said he'll be there shortly to unlock the door so they can just check inside. He arrives at 5:33 PM. I'm sure officers don't expect there to be anything sinister behind the door. Welfare checks are pretty common and most of the time there's no issue. But inside the apartment they find an unresponsive male who they estimate to be about 10 years old. He's not breathing and he has no pulse. The officer begins CPR and they rush the boy to hospital. As you can probably guess, the boy was Garrett Phillips. He was alone in the apartment at the time he was found. His mother, Tandy Cyrus, was out of the house picking up her younger son Aaron from daycare. Garrett had basketball practice that evening and her plan was to head straight from daycare to meet Garrett at basketball. She had last spoken to her son on the phone at 4:30 PM after he'd finished school. But of course, he never arrives at basketball. Police managed to get hold of Tandy to tell her that her son has been rushed to hospital, and she immediately contacts her ex-boyfriend, a man called John Jones, at 6:08 PM and asks him to go to the hospital to meet her there. She needed support. John Jones was a sheriff's deputy himself, and the two had previously been in a relationship, but it ended about a year earlier. Garrett's father, Robert Phillips Jr., had sadly died of a brain aneurysm when Garrett was just 2 years old, so Tandy couldn't turn to him for support. At 7:18 PM on the 24th of October 2011, Garrett Phillips is pronounced dead at just 12 years old. His cause of death was determined to be suffocation and strangulation. The sudden death of such a young boy catches the attention of the police, obviously, and it immediately becomes a police investigation. One of the lead investigators on the case was Lieutenant Mark Murray. They head straight away to tape off the apartment as a crime scene, and it's deeply analysed. DNA samples are taken, photos are taken. The officers noticed that the blinds are bent outwards in the third bedroom, displaced just big enough for a human body to fit through. It became obvious that whoever had harmed Garrett had exited out of this bedroom window. The tiles below were cracked as if they'd had the full weight of a human body fall onto them. But strangely, no one in the downstairs apartment nor on the street saw or heard anything that could have been somebody jumping out of this window. Tandy Cyrus is called to the police station for her first interview at 8:30 a.m. the next morning, where she is officially informed that this is a homicide case. She brings John along with her to speak to the police. Garrett's father's family, the Phillips, lived just outside of Potsdam in a place called Parishville, which was a small rural community. Despite his father's tragic death early in life, Garrett remained incredibly close with his father's side of the family. His uncle took the place of a father figure in his life, and Garrett spent a lot of time with his uncle, grandparents and cousins. An officer who had connections with Parishville stopped to talk to the family the very same night that Garrett died. I'm sure as a comfort, but also to start getting as much information as possible about Garrett's life. And the Phillips family immediately point the finger at a man called Oral Nicholas Hillary, known as Nick to everyone. Nick was Tandy's ex-boyfriend and apparently had a tumultuous relationship with Garrett. Nick Hillary was/is a black man originally from Jamaica, having moved to the US as a teen. He briefly joined the army before attending St. Lawrence University, where he was a successful soccer player at the collegiate level. He eventually ended up moving to Potsdam in northern New York State, where he coached the men's soccer team at Clarkson University. Nick and Tandy had met about a year previously at a bar where Tandy worked as a bartender, and Nick would often come in with colleagues after work. Nick and Tandy soon hit off and a relationship and feelings formed, despite the fact that Tandy was still in a relationship with John at this point, and Nick is married to his wife, Stacia. Nick and Stacia had 3 children together at this point, and Tandy had 2 of her own, Garrett and Aaron. The relationship seems to get pretty serious pretty quickly, and they move their families in together, finding a home big enough for them all. But it doesn't work out. Tandy's boys don't get on with Nick, and Garrett is teased at school for the fact that his mother is dating a black man. So eventually, for the best of both their families, Nick and Tandy decide to split. Tandy and her boys move to a 3-bedroom apartment at 100 Market Street. And it does seem like their relationship does continue for an amount of time after this. They try to make it work, they try to keep their relationship on the down low, but eventually they decide to just be friends. But it's probably worth noting that this account of their relationship does come from Nick. So after the Phillips family tell the police about Nick and Tandy's relationship, it's only right that the police add Nick to their list of people to talk to. Only they head straight to Nick's house to inform him of Garrett's death at 9:37 p.m. that night. And from that moment on, Nick Hillary becomes their #1 suspect in this case, and would remain so for years. Tandy gives the following statement to the police. "I have replayed everything a million times. When I put everything together, thinking about Nick's actions before and after the breakup, I think he was very possessive and controlling. When we broke up, Nick told me my kids were making my decisions for me. Nick always blamed Garrett for our breakup. He never blamed Aaron because Aaron was younger and followed Garrett's lead. I can't think of any other person who'd want to hurt Garrett." On the 25th, Mark Murray goes to observe Nick at a soccer game that he was coaching. He notes that Nick had a significant limp that day, vital evidence when they're looking for somebody who had apparently jumped out of a 2nd-story window the day before. But later, the footage that Mark filmed of Nick that night showed him to be walking completely normally. Which was it? Mark said that he would have periods of walking completely fine, and then he'd be walking with a limp for a period as well. So on the 26th of October, 2 days after Garrett's death, Nick is pulled into the station for questioning. He's asked to the station under the guise of looking at a list of students to help with the investigation. But it soon comes clear that he's not there to look at a list at all. He's there as a suspect. Nick says he's happy to help with the investigation. He wants them to find Garrett's killer as much as they do. So the police asking some simple questions, but it soon turns a little bit darker. Asking Nick things like, "Aren't you curious what Garrett said in his dying moments?" and I don't think he went there with any intention to hurt him. They say to Nick that they want to eliminate him. They ask him questions about his daughter. But Nick Hillary is a smart man. He was very well educated and he knew his rights in a situation like this. When he begins to realise he's actually there as a suspect, he starts to reply no comment to simple questions such as, what time was practice that day? The police don't arrest him, but they do read him his Miranda rights. And at that point, Nick enacts the 6th Amendment, the section of the Bill of Rights that guarantees a citizen a fair jury and the right to an attorney. He gets on the phone to a lawyer right away, and then the police tell him that they need to take his phone away from him. The police get a search warrant within the hour to photograph his body and they strip search him. They also detain and search Nick's vehicle whilst he's in the office being questioned. It wasn't a formal interview environment, he was simply sat in the office with the officers, which gave it the guise of being a casual chat, but it wasn't. Whilst in the office, they tell Nick to remove his clothes, which they photograph and take in as evidence. Everything is removed. He's forced to stand there completely naked as his body is photographed. The police are looking for proof that he jumped out of a second-story window, particularly looking for any signs of injury around his legs, ankles and feet. Nick tells them that he has no injuries, only they find a small round graze/scab on one of his ankles. It looks fresh, a couple of days old. He tells the police that he hit his ankle whilst moving furniture around his home, but he couldn't tell them exactly what piece of furniture this was. To the police, this was evidence that he had murdered Garrett and jumped out of that window. Interestingly, another police officer later testified that he'd never known anyone to be strip searched at Potsdam Police Department before. Nick Hillary was the first. Why did they do this? Was this a means to degrade him, to make him angry? Do they think that he would show his temper if they forced him to do this? Or did they genuinely need his whole body to be photographed to look for evidence? But whatever the expected outcome was, Nick completely complied. He did everything that was asked of him, no arguments, no questions. He stood naked in that office. At the same time that Nick is being held in the station, Nick's best friend and fellow soccer coach Ian Fairley is also pulled in for questioning. They seem to be wanting to get an idea of Nick's character through Ian, asking him questions such as, is he a player kind of guy? Was he pissed off that things weren't going well with Tandy? So here's the timeline of the night according to Ian's story. The police arrive at the apartment building at 100 Market Street around 5:14 PM and nobody answers the door when they knock. But the officer said he thought he could hear somebody walking around inside the apartment at around 5:24 PM. But at 5:24 PM, Nick Hillary was at Ian's house. Ian said that he knows for a fact that Nick was there at that specific time, as phone records show that Ian had made a phone call at 5:21 PM and he was put on hold. As Ian is on the phone waiting on hold, Nick walks through the door. Between 4:50 and 5:20 PM, two neighbours named Shannon and Andrew were downstairs outside the building changing a tyre on their car. They would have been stood in direct view of the window they thought the perpetrator jumped out of, but they never saw anyone there, something they probably would have noticed. So it's safe to assume that whoever jumped out of this window did so after 5:20 PM, after the neighbours went back inside, but before 5:33 PM when the landlord arrived and opened the door. Now, Ian did only live just around the corner from Garrett's apartment building. It's not impossible that Nick could have jumped out of the window at exactly 5:20 PM and ran round to Ian's, arriving there within a couple of minutes. It's a very small window of time, but it is possible. But Ian said that when Nick arrived at his house, he wasn't out of breath or panicked in any way. He was acting entirely normally, just as he would any other day. Nick contacts his lawyers, a friend from New York called Manny Tafari and a local lawyer named Jane Garland. I think it's important to give a little bit of context in this case. As I've already mentioned, Nick Hillary was a person of colour. He was a black man originally from Jamaica. The northern counties and towns of New York State are very remote and pretty hard to reach, and all in all it's a very white area. There's very few people of colour living there, including black people. But northern New York is also an area with quite a lot of prisons. A lot of the inmates from the city are sent up to this area, and a lot of these inmates are black. So you've got loads of people from around this area of northern New York working in the prison system, which tended to be the only interaction they ever got with people of colour. So we're just fed into this racism, black people were seen as criminals. So when Garrett Phillips is murdered, where do the police immediately go to? One of the very few black people living in Potsdam at the time. Now, I'm not saying that the police had no reason to question Nick Hillary. He was Tandy's former boyfriend, and it was well documented that him and Garrett didn't particularly get on. And Tandy gave the statement saying that she believed Nick was controlling and possessive, and he was the only person she could think of that could harm Garrett. So the police were right to look at him as a suspect, but the way he was treated was unlike anybody else was treated. No white suspect was ever strip searched and humiliated in the office of this police station. And even though the police had no actual evidence against him apart from this tiny graze on his ankle, they did not give up. The DNA found at the scene showed that Nick Hillary could neither be included nor excluded as a possible contributor. The latent fingerprints found at the scene were not a match. The New York State Police ordered a second DNA test, this time testing Nick's DNA against the DNA found under Garrett's fingernails. It comes back as there being no statistical support for a match. So there was nothing found at the scene that could link it to Nick Hillary. But Nick becomes known around town as the guy that killed Garrett Phillips almost immediately. He soon loses his job at the university. They refuse to allow him back on campus. And he's unable to get another job because everyone thinks of him as a child killer. So he's now unemployed, and a few years later he's got 5 kids to look after. Although he was never arrested, these accusations destroyed his life. So Nick files a civil lawsuit against the town of Potsdam for defamation amongst other things. He wanted to try to erase this reputation he now had and get his life back on track, and the lawsuit is filed in early January 2012. But in 2013, a woman called Mary Rain begins running for the district attorney's office. Part of her campaign was a promise to help keep Garrett's case alive, and she would work closely with Tandy and the Phillips family throughout, promising them that she would push for advancements in this case. And to be fair to her, that's exactly what she did. She does get elected as DA and immediately gets to work reviewing Garrett's case. And investigators begin to re-review some evidence in the form of CCTV footage from Potsdam High School on the afternoon that Garrett died. The CCTV showed a vehicle consistent with Nick's car, a 2009 light blue Honda CR-V, in the car park between 4:47 and 4:53 p.m. that afternoon. The police knew that this was the same car that Nick drove, but they couldn't confirm that it was actually Nick driving this car or that it was actually his car. You couldn't see the driver nor the number plate, so there's little they could do with this evidence. But that's until this civil lawsuit, when it finally goes to court in January 2014. This lawsuit was a really big deal for the police, as it meant that Nick was finally going to have to talk to a judge under oath. He refused to speak with the police for years. Nick confirms under oath that it was indeed him in the car park that afternoon driving his own car. But why is this such a big deal? Well, Garrett was also seen in this same CCTV footage riding his skateboard home after school. Nick had always said that he'd gone home that evening. He was home for about 20 minutes before going to Ian's house. But to get home, Nick would have had to have turned right out of the car park, his home barely a few minutes in that direction. But he doesn't. He turns left, the same way that Garrett does. He would have passed Garrett on the street seconds later, but he always denied seeing Garrett the day he died. On questioning, Nick said that he did go home that afternoon, but he may have turned left to pass Ian's home on the way just to double check he was home. This was part of his routine sometimes, but all these years later, he couldn't be entirely sure what route he took home that day. This is huge new evidence for the police, and on May 12, 2014, Mary Rain presents evidence to a grand jury to secure an indictment against Nick Hillary for murder in the second degree. This could carry a sentence of up to 25 years, and Nick is soon arrested, almost 3 years after the murder of Garrett Phillips. In the July, he's released on bail. Another important character in this story, though, is Nick's daughter, Shanna. She testified that her father was home at 4:30 that day when she arrived home from school. He then leaves Potsdam High School a few minutes after, between 4:35 and 4:40 p.m. Garrett is seen in the car park at 4:52 p.m. and it would take him approximately 6 minutes to skateboard home. The police were called to the apartment building at 5:08 p.m. that night, and you have to assume it took the neighbours a couple of minutes to hear the sounds and make the decisions to call the police. That puts Garrett being attacked at around 5:06 p.m. The police argued that Nick followed Garrett home that day, possibly parked his car up on another street and jogged to the apartment building. Nick lets himself into the apartment with a key that he had and he kills Garrett, angry that he is the reason that his relationship with Tandy didn't work out. But according to Shannon's version of the story, this can't be possible. She says that her father arrived home at around 4:55 p.m. and stayed at home for about 20 minutes before leaving to head to Ian's at around 5:15. Shanna is questioned repeatedly by the DA, who tried to catch her out on little details, but she stands strong in her story. In October 2014, a judge formally dismisses the indictment, citing misconduct on behalf of the prosecution. But the DA isn't ready to give up there. Mary Rain convenes yet another grand jury and Nick is indicted for a second time. And you've got to remember as well that the majority of the public were 100% behind this. Pretty much everyone fully believed that Nick Hillary was the man responsible for the murder of Garrett Phillips. He was hated in the community. But Nick was just a suspect because he was the ex-boyfriend of Tandy Cyrus. Tandy had told the police that he was controlling and possessive. They'd broken up because Garrett was getting picked on at school for Tandy dating a black man. That's how racist this area was. But you've got to ask the question, if they're looking into one of Tandy's exes, why aren't they looking into the other? John Jones, the sheriff's deputy. John Jones was known to be an angry man with a temper, and he was well known in the area as being racist. And Tandy had essentially cheated on him with a black man, running off with Nick and ending their relationship. I think it's fair to say that John would have been pretty pissed, as anyone would be if their partner cheated on them. 10 months before Garrett's death, Tandy had actually filed a complaint against John, saying that he'd been acting in various ways which caused Tandy to fear for the safety of herself and her 2 sons. He was sending her threatening text messages. John denies that Tandy is even the one who wrote this complaint, saying that there were words used in that letter that Tandy wouldn't even know the meaning of. In retaliation, John actually sued Tandy. But when Garrett died, the first person Tandy turned to was John. Like I mentioned, he worked in the police and he was closely involved with this investigation beginning to end. And don't get me wrong, he was kind of looked at in the beginning. John gave his own DNA samples and fingerprints and there was no match for him, just as there had been no match for Nick. They do take photos of John for evidence, but of course, he's not strip searched. In fact, he's not asked to remove any items of clothing and there are no face shots in any of the pictures. They took photos of his hands and his ankles and then he was let go on his way. All in all, the police had just as much reason to suspect John in this case as they did Nick. But they didn't suspect John. You've got to question how much of this was down to his position in the police. Lieutenant Mark Murray was one of his good friends, and how much of it was down to the colour of his skin. When Nick's lawyer, Manny Safari, asked Mark Murray why they even took any photos of John Jones at all, his answer was simply pretty much just to substantiate that we did take pictures of people besides Nick Hillary, and just to rule out the possibility that he had injuries consistent with that as well. The trial was due to begin in September 2016, and in the lead up, yet another DNA test is ordered. This third DNA test showed a minuscule partial DNA profile that was 1 million times more likely to be a match to Nick than anyone else on the planet. But does this constitute an actual DNA match? The wording is a little bit strange. It was 1 million times more likely to be him, but did this confirm that it was actually him? And it seems that the judge had the same questions because he actually tosses this evidence out of court. The sample size was simply too small and the lab the tests were done at was not validated. And hundreds of other samples tested did not match. This was the only one that did. As the trial started, Nick made the big decision to waiver the jury and go straight for a bench trial, a trial in which the judge solely chooses the verdict. Turns out, in hindsight, that was probably the correct choice to make. And one of the jury members was friends with the Phillips family, and somebody else was someone that Nancy Rain knew. I doubt it would have been a fair trial. The People versus Oral Nicholas Hillary began on September 12, 2016. The defence argued that the police investigation had been tunnel visioned since day one, that Nick had remained their only suspect despite there being no evidence. The prosecution focused mainly on the CCTV evidence from the car park that night, saying that Nick had turned left instead of right, showing that he was hunting Garrett Phillips. The prosecution intended to call up a man called Andrew as a witness, one of the neighbours who had been outside changing his tyre in full view of the window on the night that Garrett died. Andrew was going to testify that he'd seen a black man or a silhouette that fitted Nick Hillary in the window that afternoon. The defence found out about this and they were shocked, as Andrew had said nothing about this in any of his original statements on the day it occurred. He'd simply never mentioned it before. So the defence got in contact with Shannon, his girlfriend, who was also there that afternoon, and she said that Andrew was lying. Neither of them had seen anything, and he'd never mentioned anything about seeing anyone in that window before. And then other shocking new evidence comes to light in the defence's favour. A man called Gregory Brown, who was an inmate in prison who'd been interviewed, had said that he'd seen John Jones entering 100 Market Street approximately 15 minutes before Garrett did that afternoon. Gregory knew John as they used to play football together, so he recognised him straight away. Gregory spoke in Nick's favour, saying that he couldn't believe that a black man could kill somebody in Potsdam and jump out of a second-storey window and run down the street without anyone noticing a thing. John Jones, of course, denied this allegation. He said that he was never at Market Street that afternoon, it never happened, but this was still huge for the defence regardless, because the fact that the prosecution didn't disclose this sooner was a huge scandal. Pure and simple, the information had been hidden from the defence. The defence asked the judge for a dismissal, but they decided against calling Gregory in as a witness because the passage of time had made his account unreliable, as time does. If John Jones really was seen walking into 100 Market Street 15 minutes before Garrett, that is huge. But John did have a good alibi for the time of the murder. He was seen on CCTV walking his dog, so I don't really know if we can point the finger at him. But he does literally pass Garrett skateboarding in the street as he's out walking. Almost all of the prosecution's case around Nick was based around the fact that he would have driven past Garrett in the street, and therefore that meant that he was hunting him down. But John is also seen in the same street as Garrett on CCTV just before he died. If you're going by the same standards, shouldn't this make John suspicious as well as Nick? The prosecution attempted to paint Nick as an obsessed psychopath who kills Garrett to get back at Tandy for dumping him. They described it as the most bizarre convergence of coincidences. But at the end of the day, they had no physical evidence whatsoever to tie Nick to the crime scene. Their case was entirely based on circumstantial evidence. The verdict comes back and Nick Hillary is found not guilty of murder in the second degree, and he's allowed to walk out of court as an innocent man. All in all, this case is particularly interesting to analyse because essentially you've got two men. You've got Nick Hillary and John Jones in incredibly similar situations. One black and one white. But only the black man was suspected in these crimes, despite there being no evidence whatsoever. After the verdict, Nancy Rain makes a statement saying there will be no search for anyone else. He was 100% guilty, I'm certain of that. Which is a strange thing to say, to refuse to look for anybody else in the case. This doesn't sound like getting justice for Garrett. This sounds like railroading Nick Hillary. The police were so tunnel visioned on Nick from the start that you've got to ask the question, what else could they have found if they'd searched in other directions? I can't tell you if Nick is guilty or not. Maybe he did do it. Legally, he didn't. But maybe John Jones is guilty, or maybe it's somebody else entirely. It's pretty clear that Garrett was likely killed by somebody he knew and trusted rather than a stranger. It seems that he let whoever did it into the apartment himself. But it should always be a case of someone being innocent until proven guilty. The whole town decided that Nick was guilty before there was even a chance to look elsewhere. And this whole story can make you lose sight of the fact that the most important thing in this case is that a 12-year-old boy was murdered in cold blood. He was strangled and we still have no answers because the police didn't look for them. Nick has filed a second lawsuit against Potsdam, which is still pending, including an allegation of racial discrimination. In June 2018, Mary Rain was barred from practicing law for 2 years due to severe and persistent misconduct. She was replaced by a new DA who said they're reviewing new leads in the Garrett Phillips case and it's currently an ongoing murder investigation. I really hope this case is solved and we get true justice for Garrett. If you would like to hear about this case in even more detail, then it is now streaming on Now TV. Purchase the entertainment pass for $8.99 for this documentary and so many other high quality accounts of true crime. I'll be really interested to hear what you guys all think about this case in the comments down below. Do you think Nick Hillary is guilty? Do you think it's somebody else? Do you think this case was fair in any way? Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I think this could invoke some really interesting discussions. And a huge thank you to Now TV for sponsoring this video. Make sure you subscribe to my channel before you click away, and maybe click that bell icon so you can get notified every single time I upload. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.